The impossible specification. July 1940, Europe was burning. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Army had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable, and America was watching with growing alarm. The U.S. Army knew it needed to modernize fast, but there was a problem. While German forces rolled across Europe in motorized columns, the American military was still largely dependent on horses and motorcycles for reconnaissance and light transport. They needed something better, something modern, something that could go anywhere and do everything. On July 11th, the Army's Quartermaster Corps sent out a request for proposals to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The specifications seemed almost deliberately impossible. They wanted a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle with 4-wheel drive that could carry a crew of 3 men plus equipment. It had to weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. It needed a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches and a height low enough to fit under aircraft. The engine had to produce at least 40 horsepower, and the entire vehicle had to cost less than $750. Oh, and one more thing, they needed a working prototype in 49 days. 133 companies looked at the specifications and politely declined. It couldn't be done. The weight requirement alone was absurd. You couldn't build a vehicle that small with 4-wheel drive and enough structural integrity to survive combat conditions. The deadline was equally ridiculous. 49 days from drawings to a working prototype impossible. Only 2 companies were desperate enough to try. Willys Overland Motors was struggling financially and saw a massive military contract as potential salvation. American Bantam Car Company, a tiny firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, was on the verge of bankruptcy and had nothing to lose. Bantam's chief engineer, Karl Probst, worked through days and nights without sleep sketching designs and calculating weight distributions. On September 23, 1940, Bantam delivered their prototype, the Blitz buggy, to Camp Holabird, Maryland for testing. It weighed in at 1,840 pounds, well over the specification, but it worked. The Army was impressed enough to order 70 more for extended trials. Willys submitted their prototype, called the Quad, in November. It was heavier than the Bantam, but had something the others lacked: real power. The Go Devil engine, developed by engineer Delmar Barney Roos, produced 60 honest horsepower and 105 pound-feet of torque. When Army testers drove it, they couldn't believe how much punch the little vehicle had. Ford Motor Company, seeing an opportunity, submitted their own entry in November as well. By early 1941, the Army had prototypes from all 3 companies undergoing brutal testing, driving through mud, sand, and water, climbing impossible grades, getting deliberately abused to see what would break. In July 1941, the Army made their decision. Willys won the production contract primarily because of that powerful engine, but they also incorporated the best design features from Bantam and Ford, the body styling the flat hood with recessed headlights, various mechanical improvements. The result was designated the Willys Model MB. Ford was contracted to produce identical vehicles under license, calling them the Ford GPW. The W stood for Willys, acknowledging whose design they were building. From 1941 to 1945, over 640,000 of these vehicles rolled off American assembly lines. The soldiers started calling them Jeeps, possibly derived from GP for general purpose, or maybe from a character in the Popeye cartoons named Eugene the Jeep, who could go anywhere and do anything. The name stuck. Baptism under fire. The first Jeeps shipped overseas arrived in Britain in late 1941. British officers looked at them skeptically. They were small. They looked flimsy. The British had their own vehicles that seemed more substantial. But when British soldiers actually drove them, opinions changed fast. The Jeep was quick, nimble, and could handle terrain that would bog down larger vehicles. When it did get stuck, 4 men could lift it free. It was mechanically simple enough that field repairs were straightforward, and that engine, that magnificent Go Devil, had power to spare. The real test came in North Africa. British General Bernard Montgomery used Jeeps extensively during the Desert War, and one operation in particular demonstrated what they could do. Before the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Montgomery organized a daring raid on German supply lines. Teams of Jeeps mounted with machine guns infiltrated deep behind enemy lines under cover of darkness. They found a German supply convoy fuel trucks heading to resupply Rommel's tanks. The Jeeps attacked at high speed, weaving through the convoy, their machine guns setting truck after truck ablaze. Before the Germans could organize a defense, the Jeeps vanished into the night. The next morning, German tanks arrived at their refueling point expecting the fuel that should have arrived overnight. Instead, they found nothing. They didn't even have enough fuel to retreat. Many were immobilized sitting ducks when the British attack came. The loss of those tanks contributed directly to Germany's defeat at El Alamein, a turning point in the North African campaign. And it had been accomplished by a handful of toy vehicles that some had dismissed as too small to matter. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent years following American troops across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France developed a deep affection for the Jeep. In June 1943, writing from Allied headquarters in North Africa, he captured what soldiers felt about the vehicle. "Good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for and still keeps on going." He wasn't exaggerating. Jeeps served as reconnaissance vehicles, staff cars, ambulances, supply haulers, communication platforms, and weapons carriers. Soldiers mounted machine guns on them, usually the Browning M19-119 .30 caliber, though some carried the heavier 50 caliber M2. They installed radios for forward observation and artillery spotting. They fitted them with stretchers and used them to evacuate wounded soldiers from places larger ambulances couldn't reach. Some Jeeps were equipped with wire cutters on the front bumper, a grim necessity after D-Day, when German forces strung cables across roads at neck height specifically to decapitate Jeep drivers. The enemy takes notice. German forces encountered their first captured Jeeps in North Africa. Initial reactions were dismissive. German troops had their own light vehicle, the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, designed by Ferdinand Porsche. It was a capable machine derived from the Beetle design, and it had served German forces well in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. The Kübelwagen was lighter than the Jeep, got better fuel economy, and had a lower silhouette. Some German officers looked at the American vehicle and saw an oversized, over-engineered toy. But the soldiers who actually used both vehicles came to very different conclusions. The Jeep had four-wheel drive. The Kübelwagen had only rear-wheel drive. The Jeep could carry heavier loads and tow artillery pieces. The Jeep had standardized mounting points for radios, weapons, and equipment. The Kübelwagen required special variants for different roles. Most importantly, the Jeep had double the horsepower, and far more torque. When American forces pushed north through Italy and later across France, German troops who captured intact Jeeps discovered something uncomfortable. The American vehicle was simply better for military purposes. A 1944 U.S. War Department technical manual on German military forces noted that Wehrmacht units loved and coveted the Jeep because they all were chronically short of motorized transport. This wasn't propaganda. This was American intelligence officers interviewing captured German soldiers and assessing battlefield reports. German units at every level, regular Wehrmacht infantry divisions, elite Waffen-SS units, even the Volkssturm militia would seize, captured Jeeps whenever possible. Sometimes the vehicles were pressed into immediate service with their new owners. More often, they were sent to rear areas where the Waffenamt, the Wehrmacht ordnance branch, would refurbish them and redistribute them to units that needed light transport. After the war, historian Hugh Cole interviewed surrendered Wehrmacht generals for the official U.S. Army history. Multiple generals admitted that they admired the Jeep more than anything else in the American arsenal. Think about that for a moment. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang fighter, not American artillery or the famous Garand rifle. The Jeep, a quarter-ton utility truck, impressed German generals more than weapons systems designed specifically to destroy their armies. The grudging respect turned into something approaching envy as the war progressed. German logistics were collapsing. Fuel shortages meant that even vehicles they had were often immobilized. The German military had never fully motorized. They still relied heavily on horses for supply transport, even in 1944. American forces, by contrast, seemed to have unlimited mobility, and everywhere the Germans looked, they saw Jeeps, hauling supplies, carrying officers, mounting radios, evacuating wounded, moving constantly, going everywhere, doing everything. Operation Greif. In December 1944, Hitler authorized one of the war's most unusual operations. He was planning a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. As part of the operation, he tasked SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny with organizing Panzer Brigade 150, a special unit composed of English-speaking German soldiers who would infiltrate American lines using captured equipment. The mission, codenamed Operation Greif, would see German commandos wearing American uniforms, driving American vehicles, and attempting to seize key bridges ahead of the main German advance. Skorzeny managed to gather American uniforms, weapons, and about 30 captured Jeeps. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. German soldiers who spoke English would drive captured Jeeps through American lines, bluff their way past checkpoints, using forged papers and confident attitudes, then race ahead to capture and hold bridges until the main German forces arrived. The captured Jeeps were essential to the plan. Nothing else would work. German vehicles would be recognized immediately. The Jeeps would allow his men to blend in with the chaos of American units moving around during the battle. The operation was a complete failure, but not for the reasons you might expect. Skorzeny was an excellent commando. He'd previously led the daring rescue of Mussolini from an Italian mountaintop prison. But he wasn't an expert in American military procedures, and he made a critical mistake about the Jeeps. German light vehicles, like the Kübelwagen, typically carried 4 men. Skorzeny saw that Jeeps had 4 seats and assumed American practice would be the same. But normal American doctrine was to assign only 2 men to a Jeep occasionally, 3. 4 men in a Jeep was unusual. Once American forces were alerted to the infiltration attempt, they started watching for that specific detail. Any Jeep carrying 4 men got stopped at gunpoint or simply shot on sight. The irony was perfect. German forces wanted American Jeeps so badly that they launched a special operation built around captured vehicles. And the operation failed partly because the Germans didn't fully understand how Americans actually used them. None of Scorsini's teams reached their objectives. Several were captured. Some were executed as spies for wearing American uniforms. The bridges remained in American hands, and the Bulge offensive ultimately failed. The Jeeps that were supposed to enable German victory instead became one more symbol of how thoroughly American logistics and equipment dominated the war. The numbers tell the story. By the end of World War II, American factories had produced 647 925 Jeeps. Willys built $363,000. Ford built $280,000. Bantam squeezed out of production contracts, but vindicated in their original design, built 2,675 before switching to building trailers. The production numbers were staggering, but even more impressive was where they went. Jeeps served in every theater of war Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the China, Burma, India theater. They fought in deserts where temperatures reached 130 degrees and in Arctic conditions where metal froze and engines refused to start. They waded through swamps in the Pacific Islands and climbed mountain roads in Italy. Under the Lend-Lease program, approximately 50,000 Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union. Soviet forces, chronically short of light vehicles, were enthusiastic about them. They used captured German vehicles when they could, but American Jeeps were better. After the war, the Soviets even developed their own version, the Gia Z67, heavily influenced by the American design. 30% of total Jeep production went to Allied forces. Britain received thousands. Free French forces used them. Even Chinese nationalist forces fighting the Japanese received them. The Jeep's versatility was legendary. At the Normandy invasion, 39 Jeeps landed on D-Day, specifically waterproofed for the beach landings. They protected the beachhead from Luftwaffe attacks, not by shooting down aircraft themselves, but by hauling anti-aircraft guns and serving as mobile fire control platforms. Airborne divisions used them extensively. Jeeps were flown in gliders alongside paratroopers during Operation Market Garden. Modified versions were airdropped with parachute units. Some Jeeps were fitted with railroad wheels so they could run on train tracks for reconnaissance behind enemy lines. There were armored Jeeps with makeshift steel plating, Jeeps modified as snowplows during the Battle of the Bulge, Jeeps fitted with stretchers serving as field ambulances in places no other vehicle could reach. SAS units in Europe used Jeeps for lightning raids deep behind German lines. Pacific Island hopping campaigns relied on Jeeps to move supplies through jungle terrain where larger vehicles were useless. The Jeep hauled 37 mm anti-tank guns into position. It towed trailers doubling its cargo capacity. It mounted chemical mortars for smoke screens. Soldiers found uses that designers never imagined. The German perspective. After the war ended, more details emerged about how German forces had viewed American equipment. The U.S. War Department's Technical Manual, TME 30451, Handbook on German Military Forces, included a section specifically comparing the Kubelwagen to the Jeep. The assessment was blunt: the Volkswagen. The German equivalent of the American Jeep is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. That single sentence buried in a technical manual told the story. Yes, the Kubelwagen had more comfortable seats, but for every other military purpose that mattered, The American vehicle was superior. It could carry more weight, it had more power, it could go more places, it was more versatile, it could be modified for more roles. And most damningly, from the German perspective, it was produced in such massive numbers that American forces had them everywhere, while German troops were chronically short of even their own inferior vehicles. British engineers who examined captured Kübelwagens were similarly unimpressed. A 1943 report by the Humber Car Company, after dissecting a Kübelwagen captured in North Africa, concluded it exhibited no special brilliance in design and should not be regarded as an example of first-class modern design to be copied by British industry. The Germans had built a competent vehicle. The Americans had built something better and produced it in quantities that transformed warfare. German soldiers interviewed after the war spoke with grudging respect about American mobility. One recurring theme in these interviews was surprise at how many vehicles the Americans had. German units moved supplies by horse-drawn cart. American supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles, all motorized. German infantry divisions walked. American infantry divisions rode in trucks or jeeps. The disparity in mobility meant American forces could concentrate faster, respond to threats quicker, and maintain operational tempo that exhausted German defenders. The legacy General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during World War II, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, said it was one of the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to victory, alongside the C-47 transport plane, the 2.5-ton truck, and the bulldozer. These weren't casual compliments from men prone to exaggeration. These were professional military leaders assessing what equipment actually won the war. Bill Mauldin, the famous wartime cartoonist, created an illustration that became iconic among soldiers. It showed a grizzled sergeant standing beside his jeep with his pistol drawn, tears streaming down his face, about to shoot his faithful vehicle like a dying horse. The cartoon captured something profound about how soldiers felt about these machines. They weren't just equipment, they were companions, partners. The Jeep that had carried you through Africa and Italy and France, that had never broken down when you needed it, that had saved your life a dozen times when it finally wore out beyond repair, saying goodbye, felt like losing a friend. After the war, the Jeep's influence extended far beyond military applications. Willys converted the MB into civilian versions, the CJ series that became legendary in their own right. Soldiers returning home remembered the vehicles that had served them so well and wanted to own them. Farmers discovered they were perfect for rough terrain. Hunters used them to reach remote areas. The entire category of recreational four-wheel drive vehicles traces its lineage back to the wartime Jeep. Land Rover, Toyota Land Cruiser. Every modern SUV, they all exist because the Willys MB proved there was demand for capable go-anywhere vehicles. The name Jeep became one of the most recognized brand names in the world. Willys trademarked it after the war and built an entire company around the reputation earned in combat. Today, Jeep is still producing vehicles directly descended from that 1941 design. The Wrangler still has the same basic profile: flat hood, vertical grille, exposed wheels, open top option. It's a deliberate homage to the vehicle that started it all. In 1991, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Willys MB Jeep an International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark. The citation recognized it as both a technical achievement and a vehicle that had genuine historical impact. Very few machines receive such recognition. The Jeep earned it. The vehicle that wasn't supposed to exist. Looking back, the entire Jeep story seems improbable. 133 companies said it couldn't be built to the Army's specifications. The 2 companies that tried almost failed to deliver. The final vehicle exceeded the weight limit by nearly 1,000 pounds. By every rational metric, the project should have been a failure. Instead, it became one of the most successful military vehicles ever created and changed automotive history forever. The secret was that the Army's impossible specifications forced innovation. Making it light enough demanded creative engineering. Making it powerful enough required a brilliant engine design. Making it versatile enough meant standardizing mounting points and keeping the structure simple. Making it cheap enough required mass production techniques that revolutionized manufacturing. The constraints that seemed impossible to meet actually guided designers toward the perfect solution. When Hitler and German military leaders initially saw reports of the American Jeep, their dismissal made sense from their perspective. It looked small and simple. The Kübelwagen seemed more sophisticated with its Porsche engineering pedigree. But wars aren't won by sophisticated designs. They're won by effective ones. The Jeep was effective in ways that transcended any single specification. It worked. It kept working. It did everything soldiers needed it to do and more. And American industry produced them in such quantities that they became ubiquitous symbols of American military might. The German generals who begged for captured Jeeps learned what soldiers already knew. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the most advanced or most impressive. Sometimes it's just the one that works every single time, no matter what you ask it to do. The Jeep went everywhere. It did everything. And it never let you down. That's why Ernie Pyle called it a divine instrument of wartime locomotion. That's why soldiers loved it. That's why even the enemy wanted it. The little quarter-ton truck that was supposed to be impossible to build became the vehicle that won the war. Not through firepower or armor or speed, but through reliability, versatility, and sheer determination qualities that also described the American soldiers who drove them. The Jeep was America on 4 wheels, practical, unpretentious, ready for anything, and far tougher than it looked. Hitler laughed at it. His generals wanted it. History proved which judgment was correct. 75 years later, descendants of that original Willys MB are still being produced and sold, still climbing mountains and crossing deserts, still proving that sometimes the best answer to an impossible problem is to build it anyway and let it prove itself in the field. The Jeep did exactly that and changed the world in the process.